The year was 1887, and the quiet on Miriam Crow's homestead pressed down like a living thing. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a weight, a presence as real as the fine dust that gathered on the mantel above the cold hearth, or the smooth, worn grain of the table where she ate her meals alone. For 2 years, ever since her husband Daniel had been claimed by a fever that swept through him like wildfire across the prairie, that silence had been her most faithful companion. It lingered in the empty space beside her in bed, in the unused rocking chair by the stove, and in the endless stretch of Wyoming plains rolling out from her porch in every direction. Even the land itself, with its sage-covered hills and sky, so vast it seemed too empty to breathe beneath, mirrored her stillness, holding its breath right along with her. Miriam lived by the strict rhythm of routine, the only dam she had to keep grief from flooding her. She rose before dawn, when the eastern horizon bruised into deep purples and pale rose. She milked her single cow, scattered grain for the hens, and tended the meager vegetable patch, her only concession to a future she wasn't sure she believed in. Her movements were clipped, stripped of any wasted effort. Her face rarely shifted from the expressionless mask she wore, hiding the hollow ache inside. To the folks in the nearby town of Clearwater, Miriam Crow appeared as a capable widow, strong, self-reliant, unshakable. What they didn't see were the rare moments in the barn, when she would pause beside Daniel's workbench, her palm pressed to its rough splintered surface, and allow one hot tear to cut a clean trail through the dust on her cheek before she wiped it away with a calloused hand. To them, she looked resilient. To her, it felt like surrender. Men like Curtis Boyd, the heavy-set merchant who owned most of Clearwater's trade and all of its gossip, saw in her an opportunity. Whenever she ventured into his store, his voice oozed false sympathy as he suggested she sell her land. "Too much for a woman alone, Miriam," he'd say, his eyes always lingering on the property he coveted. "A respectable widow belongs in town, where she can be taken care of." His words were a cage wrapped in velvet, polite enough to pass as kindness, but meant to keep her contained. Every time he spoke them, something cold and iron-hard tightened in her gut. She was only 32, yet society had already decided she belonged on a shelf, another relic of a life that was done. Her trips into Clearwater were rare and purely practical, armed with a shopping list she used like a shield. But on one sweltering afternoon in late August, as she drove her wagon down the dusty main street thinking only of flour, salt, and the comfort of solitude back home, she saw the town gathered for something far darker. A restless crowd had formed outside Boyd's mercantile, ranch hands, farmers, and curious townsfolk in a rough circle. The air was thick with an ugly sort of excitement, a mix of cruel amusement and sharp curiosity. Curtis Boyd stood atop a crate, his face flushed with self-importance. Beside him were 2 armed men. Between them stood a figure that made Miriam's breath lock in her chest. The man was tall, powerfully built, his skin the deep sun-burnished copper of the Dine people. His hands were bound in thick rope, his ankles shackled. But what struck her most, what made the air seem to vanish, was the coarse burlap sack pulled over his head, knotted tightly at the neck, erasing his face entirely. He stood perfectly still, a pillar of restrained power in the midst of the jeering crowd. "Found wandering on Prescott land," Boyd bellowed, projecting his voice so it reached the farthest edges of the crowd. "A drifter, a vagrant. But look at the muscle on him. Waste of strength to let it sit idle." He jabbed a finger into the man's arm, as though testing livestock. The prisoner didn't so much as flinch. "I've spoken with the marshal," Boyd went on. "Instead of rotting in a cell, we're offering the public a chance to put him to work. 1 year's contract, strong back, endless stamina. Let's start the bidding at $5. A ripple of disgust moved through Miriam, cold and sharp. This wasn't a sale, it was a performance of power. A man's dignity stripped away in front of a crowd eager to watch. The bids came quickly, tossed out like insults. $2. Can't even see what you're buying with that sack on his head. 3. Another shouted, followed by a crude laugh and a joke that made her stomach turn. Miriam froze at the edge of the square, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The man on the crate stood in the same rigid stillness she had first noticed, but now she recognized it. It wasn't resignation. It was control, the kind born of someone containing something vast and dangerous inside. And in him, she saw herself. The way people looked at her with pity or condescension, the way others tried to dictate her place in the world. But for him, the injustice was 100-fold heavier. Before she could think, the words were out of her mouth. $1. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like the crack of a rifle. The crowd's murmurs died instantly. Dozens of eyes swung toward her. The widow crow. Boyd narrowed his eyes, a slow, mocking smile creeping onto his face. Pardon, Miriam? Did I hear you right? She lifted her chin, tightening her grip on her basket until her knuckles blanched. I said $1. The square erupted with disbelief and laughter. Too low to be serious, an insult to the spectacle Boyd was trying to stage. But the other men didn't bid. They glanced at Miriam and kept their mouths shut. No one wanted to be seen besting a grieving widow over something like this. Boyd's smirk curdled into irritation. She'd spoiled his show. Fine, he said, the words spitting out like a bad taste. Sold to the widow crow for $1. Let's hope you know what to do with him. He kicked the crate, and the bound man stepped down. One of Boyd's men shoved the rope into her hands. It was thick, rough, and heavier than she'd expected. The crowd parted as Miriam walked forward, their stares prickling her skin, some shocked, some sneering, others filled with a fresh, more insidious pity. The man was even taller up close, his presence almost too large for the space between them. She could hear his steady breathing beneath the burlap. A flicker of fear caught in her chest. What had she just done? But she met his invisible gaze head-on, gave the rope a small, firm tug. Come, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Without resistance, he followed, the shackles on his ankles dragging softly through the dust. The rhythm of those chains was the only sound as she led him toward her wagon. The wagon creaked beneath them as the sun slid lower, washing the land in long streaks of gold and rust. Miriam kept her eyes on the road, hands tight around the reins, but her awareness never strayed far from the man sitting in the back. He hadn't spoken a single word since they'd left town. The burlap still covered his head, swaying slightly with the wagon's movement. Every so often, she could feel his gaze, even through the rough weave of the fabric. Dust rose from the trail in slow, curling plumes. The late summer air clung to her skin, heavy and unmoving. She thought of the stairs back in the square, the sharp-edged whispers she'd pretended not to hear. She'd felt them all before, when her husband had died, when the bank men came to offer advice, when the neighbors hinted at what a woman alone should or shouldn't do. But never had she made such a public defiance. Half a mile out, she slowed the horses and set the brake. The stillness felt loud. She turned on the bench, the creak of wood echoing in the open quiet. Hold still, she said, stepping down. Her boots scuffed in the dust as she climbed into the wagon bed. He sat perfectly straight, hands still bound, shackles dull in the fading light. She reached up, fingers brushing the coarse sack. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Whoever he was, she'd just bought him in front of an entire town. If she removed this, there was no putting it back. She pulled. The burlap came away, and she froze. Dark, watchful eyes met hers, steady, unblinking. His hair was black as coal, brushing his shoulders, framing a face weathered not by age, but by the kind of miles a man walks when the world offers no welcome. There was no fear in him, no pleading either, just the quiet, unnerving weight of someone measuring her in return. Miriam's mouth went dry. She held the sack in her hands, but couldn't quite find the words she thought she'd speak. Finally, he tilted his head just slightly, his voice deep, low, and deliberate. You didn't ask what I did. Her grip tightened on the rough fabric. Would it matter? His lips curved, not into a smile, but into something that might have been the shadow of one. To most people. She stepped back, the wagon rocking under her weight as she climbed down. Well, she said, flicking the reins to set the horses moving again. I'm not most people. The chains clinked softly behind her as they rolled on toward the horizon, the first stars beginning to pierce the evening sky. By the time the wagon rattled up to her land, the sky had gone indigo, the horizon holding onto the last smear of daylight. Miriam guided the horses to a stop beside the well, their labored breathing fogging in the cooling air. Her homestead stood like a stubborn relic against the prairie's emptiness. A small clapboard house, its white paint worn to gray in places, the porch boards warped but solid. Beyond it, the barn loomed, silent and shadowed, the corral empty. She climbed down first, her boots sinking into the soft earth. The man in the wagon bed didn't move until she circled back and unlatched the tailgate. Even then, he rose without a sound, the chains giving a dull rattle with each step. Inside, she said, nodding toward the house. He obeyed, but not in the way a man cowed into obedience might. His stride was unhurried, his gaze drifting over the yard, the fields, the distant tree line, as though committing every inch to memory. Miriam unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The air inside was cooler, smelling faintly of cedar and the bread she'd baked the morning before. The low glow of a single oil lamp painted the walls in soft amber. He stepped in, pausing just inside the threshold. His eyes roamed the modest space. The wooden table and chairs, the cast-iron stove, the quilt folded neatly over the settee. It wasn't much, but it was all hers. She pointed toward the far corner where a sturdy chair sat against the wall. There, he sat without protest, the lamplight catching on the iron links at his wrists. She moved behind him, pulling a key from her apron pocket. For a moment, the metallic scent of the shackles filled the air as she leaned close, sliding the key into the lock. The click was louder than she expected. The cuffs fell away, leaving faint marks on his skin. You're free to eat, to sleep, she said, stepping back, but not to leave. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers over his shoulder. Why bring me here? Miriam crossed her arms, her voice flat. Because you look like a man worth saving. A faint flicker, not quite surprise, not quite amusement, touched his expression. And if you're wrong? She didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the stove, ladling stew into a bowl. The smell of slow-cooked meat and onions filled the room. She set it in front of him with a spoon, then stepped away. He ate without hurry, each movement deliberate. She watched him from the corner of her eye, wondering what kind of man kept that kind of calm after everything that had happened to him. Outside, the prairie wind sighed against the walls, carrying the first hint of night's chill. That night, the prairie was so still it felt as though the world had stopped turning. The only sound was the faint creak of the rafters as the house settled into the cold. Miriam lay in her bed, the quilt pulled tight to her chin, her eyes fixed on the ceiling's faint shadows. She could hear him moving, slow, deliberate, in the front room. A man with chains removed was still a man to watch. At first, it was the clink of the spoon against the bowl, then the scrape of the chair legs on the floor. After that, silence. Her mind wandered despite herself. She thought about the way he'd sat so calmly under her roof, like someone who wasn't afraid of being judged or thrown out. A man like that either had nothing left to lose, or had already lost it all. A faint thud made her tense. Footsteps, soft but sure, moved toward her bedroom door. She reached under her pillow and wrapped her fingers around the worn handle of the revolver she kept there. Her breath stayed even, her eyes on the faint seam of light under the door. The steps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the hush of the night. Then, in a voice low enough to almost be a thought, he said, "I'll sleep by the fire." The floorboards creaked as he retreated. A moment later, she heard the rustle of a blanket being spread out, then the soft collapse of a body lying down. She didn't sleep for a long time. When morning light finally seeped through the thin curtains, Miriam found him awake already, crouched by the hearth as he coaxed the fire back to life. His hands moved with quiet skill, stacking wood, blowing gently until the embers caught. "You didn't have to do that," she said from the doorway. He glanced up. "Keeps the cold off. For both of us." For a heartbeat, she almost smiled. Almost. She turned away before he could read her expression, the familiar armor of her voice slipping back into place. "Eat. We've got work." The day, she decided, would tell her more than the night had. The morning sun spilled over the prairie like molten gold, cutting away the last threads of frost clinging to the grass. Miriam handed him a tin mug of coffee and a slice of bread before leading the way outside. The land was quiet, but far from empty. A thin line of smoke curled from the barn roof where the stove inside kept the tools from rusting. Beyond it, the fields stretched bare, waiting for spring planting. "You can start by splitting those logs," she said, nodding toward the stack by the chopping block. He studied the pile for a moment, then shrugged off his coat. The swing of the axe came smooth and sure, the crack of wood echoing through the air. Miriam lingered by the fence, pretending to check the latch, but really she was watching, not the work itself, but the way he moved. No wasted effort, no showmanship, just steady strength. When he paused to wipe his brow, she said, "You've done this before. Enough to know you've got more winter than wood." He replied, setting another log in place. She left him to it and went to the barn, feeding the chickens and checking the feed barrels. From inside, she could still hear the steady rhythm of chopping, a sound that was strangely reassuring. By midday, the log pile had doubled. He set the axe aside and leaned on the handle, his breathing even. "You hungry?" she called from the porch. "Starving." Lunch was simple: boiled potatoes, salted pork, and more bread. He ate like a man used to making every bite count, not rushing, but leaving nothing behind. Afterward, she showed him the corral. The fence needed mending, the posts tilting from years of wind. He knelt, driving nails without being told, working until his hands were coated in dust and pine sap. "You fix things without asking why," she said. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. Some things don't need asking. They worked until the sun began to sink, staining the sky in copper and crimson. The wind picked up, carrying the distant howl of a coyote. Back inside, the lamplight softened the edges of the day. Miriam poured 2 bowls of stew and set them on the table. Neither spoke much, but the quiet wasn't as sharp as it had been the night before. Somewhere between the swing of an axe and the clink of a spoon, the air between them had shifted, not trust, not yet, but something close enough to make her wonder. The next day passed without trouble. The work was steady, the air crisp, and the hours slipped by under the quiet rhythm of chores. By late afternoon, the wind carried the smell of snow, sharp, clean, and full of warning. Miriam was on the porch stacking kindling when she heard it. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. Not the casual rap of a neighbor, but something heavier, as if meant to be heard from far inside. She straightened, her eyes flicking toward the man. He was sitting at the table mending a leather strap, but now his head had lifted, his shoulders tightening just slightly. "Expecting someone?" he asked, voice low. "No." The knock came again, 3 firm beats. Miriam stepped inside, wiping her hands on her apron, and moved toward the door. Through the narrow gap in the curtains, she saw a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat brim shadowing most of his face. Behind him, a single horse stood tethered, its breath curling white in the cooling air. When she opened the door just a crack, the man's voice rolled in like distant thunder. "Evening, ma'am. Looking for a traveler came this way. Big fella." rough coat, eyes like he's seen too much. Her pulse ticked faster, but her face stayed still. Plenty of travelers pass through, she said. The man shifted his weight, boots crunching on the frozen dirt. This one's different. Dangerous. Best you tell me if you've seen him. Inside, she caught a glimpse of her lodger standing in the kitchen doorway, his expression calm, but his jaw set. I haven't seen anyone like that, she said, the lie smooth as water. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've supper on the stove. The man on the porch studied her for a moment longer, then tipped his hat. If you do see him, best keep your distance. She shut the door before his shadow could fade completely from the porch. When she turned, the stranger was still watching her, his eyes unreadable. You didn't have to lie. Maybe I did, she said, brushing past him toward the stove. The rest of the evening passed without another word about the knock, but the silence carried the weight of something unspoken, and it sat between them like another presence in the room. The snow came before morning, soft at first, then heavy, wrapping the land in a pale, muffled hush. Miriam stoked the fire early, the logs popping and sending sparks up the chimney. The stranger was already awake, sitting by the window with a mug in hand, watching the white curtain swallow the world outside. You'll be snowed in by nightfall, she said, setting another log on the fire. He didn't answer right away, just traced the rim of the mug with his thumb. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. They worked through the day, tending animals, hauling water, keeping the paths clear as best they could. But the storm thickened, erasing the horizon until there was nothing beyond the yard but shifting white. By dusk, the wind howled like something alive, rattling the shutters. Miriam bolted the door, the warmth inside a fragile shield against the storm's roar. After supper, they sat in the quiet, the lamplight casting long shadows over the walls. You never asked why that man was looking for me, he said finally. I figured if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me, she replied, her voice steady. His gaze met hers across the table. I've done things I can't undo, but I'm not the man he made me out to be. She studied him for a long moment, hearing the wind claw at the roof. Everyone's got a past. What matters is what you do now. A faint smile ghosted across his face, the first she'd seen. They stayed there until the lamp burned low, the storm still raging beyond the walls. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it when it came. And for that night, in the heart of the snowbound silence, neither of them was entirely alone.